All right, I believe we are live. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are joining us from. My name's Kareem Candy. This is our very special guest, George Colligan, excuse me. And we're here to do another live interview and also a performance here. We're broadcasting to you live from the McMinimans Elks Temple in Tacoma, Washington, from their Spanish ballroom. And we're very fortunate that they have a large space and that we're able to do both a hybrid concert series this evening to a live audience and also a live stream. And this is part of it's part of a weekly live stream series that we do and also a monthly performance series that we're doing here at McMinimans now. And I should also start with, we wish all of you, to those who observe it, a very happy Easter, and hope everybody is safe and happy and healthy out there. So, George.
Hey, man.
Thank you for joining us today. We're glad you could be here again.
Always a pleasure.
So as I was telling you prior to this, normally I try and do a little bit of preparation for these interviews, but today it's kind of been just running around and I haven't really prepared, ashamedly. And I also want to start by saying any of our viewers out there, if you have questions for George or myself, we're going to do the interview for about 45 minutes, and then at the end we'll open things up for questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to let us know. And you can put them in the comments section now if you'd like, and we'll address as many as we can. So we've talked a little bit now in these interviews and outside of these interviews, and a couple of things we've discussed are some of the great artists that you've had the pleasure of working with. And I know that you've spent a good amount of time, or at least done some shows with the wonderful bassist Christian McBride. For artists that maybe will not ever have that opportunity to perform with him and maybe get a peek behind the window of what's that like, what was it like working with Christian and his band and playing his music?
Well, Christian is one of those people that I think if we look at the history of the music, we put him in that Young Lions era. I remember I heard Christian when he was 14 years old at this sort of a music festival outside of Philadelphia called Music Fest or something. And it was like kind of like education, like college bands competing, but it was like pretty high level, because at that time there was a group from Berkeley that had Roy Hargrove. I don't think he had done a record yet. It's Roy Hargrove, Antonio Hart, Chris Cheek, and then there was another group with a young Joey DeFrancesco, and Christian played in that trio. There was another band. It was Christopher Holiday. I think maybe he had just gotten signed. I went up with a group from Peabody, and nobody knew anything about us. I think we played in the basement or something. And but I heard, they were like, oh, this guy's 14, but he plays like an adult, and just thinking, oh, wow, this guy's going to be the next whomever, So then sort of seeing his career come up in the 90s and playing with everybody. I mean, he's one of those cats that's played with everyone. I mean, literally everyone. And, super in demand, and also a leader in his own right and a composer. He did a number of really great albums for Verve. And I'm trying to remember how I ended up playing with him. I was mostly just a sub for Jeffrey Keyser. So I did a lot of stuff with his quartet. Sometimes it was, I know Marcus Strickland was on the band sometimes. A different horn player, Ron Blake was in the band. Trying to think of who else. But that was kind of sporadic in the 2000s, like just being a sub every now and then. I remember we did a gig in Buffalo, of all places. If you've ever been to Buffalo, I mean, I've only been a handful of times, but I remember showing up. The hotel was downtown. It was noon on a Sunday. Nobody around. I was like, what's going on in Buffalo, And then we get to the gig and it's packed, and people, it's like they had been waiting for this band for 20 years. They were so excited. There was a bunch of guys at the gig just yelling out random names of bass players. They're just like, Paul Chambers, Jocko. It was like this really very, very enthusiastic crowd. And, I mean, Christian's he's an incredible musician, and he's a great artist. I mean, and he's a really, really genuinely warm person. In fact, I was just talking to somebody about, I did a gig with his big band at one time, and I remember when he introduced everyone in the band, you know, because sometimes you say, I mean, with a big band, it's hard. The 17 people, you got to kind of, you know, some people sort of just rifle through that, or they may not even get to that. You know, they might just introduce people as they solo, that type of thing. But he made a point to introduce everyone in the band, and he told a little story about everybody. Like, and even people like, I'm like, I didn't even know he would have a relationship with this person, just random tenor player, whatever. He got up and told a detailed story about how much he loved their playing and where they were from. I mean, it was, so he's got a pretty incredible memory. But I think he also genuinely really loves people. Like, he's just one of those extroverted people that is excited about just being around people, and he genuinely is warm, you know. At least that's how it seemed to me. So, you know, very garrulous, loves to talk about sports. I don't know a lot about sports, but, you know, he's just a very warm, kind of larger than life kind of person. And certainly as a player, I mean, I've played with a lot of great bass players, you know, just his ability on the instrument is really amazing. I mean, it's like he can do things you never thought were possible on the instrument, you know. Now, I did have the privilege of, you know, being not a sub. We did a short-lived trio, myself, Christian McBride, and Billy Hart. And we did a week at the Blue Note, a double bill with Ron Carter Golden Striker Trio. And at first I thought it was going to be the fusion, because he was doing some fusion stuff, and I was kind of part of that too, again as a sub, so here and there. And
was
then,
that the vertical vision kind of period that
yeah,
he was doing?
Yeah. So I did some of that, and but this was just, we did more of the straight ahead type of stuff, and then we did the Newport Festival. I'm trying to think if we did anything else, but I haven't done much with him since I've been on the West Coast. I think that was just at the point where I was sort of making that transition. We had him in a Zoom masterclass recently at Portland State. So, and again, it was great. He said he hasn't been doing anything, like barely anything. So, which is a drag, but it is for everybody. So, but yeah, I mean, that trio with Billy Hart, I thought maybe it would end up being something. And I recorded every night at the Blue Note, so I still have it on a hard drive.
I think he owns a record company now, so, you know, you could...
Christian?
I think so.
Does he?
Maybe I'm mistaken.
Well, everybody kind of has their own label in a way, so I don't know. Maybe I should hit him up and say, oh, I have, you know, 7 nights worth of material. Who knows? I mean... I guess he has had a number of, like, he's been doing stuff trio with Christian Sands, and he had another group.
One's with Tip City, I think, with Emmett Cohen, and the other gentleman, the guitarist, I can't remember his name at the moment. But yeah, he's got several projects going on.
Yeah, he knows a lot of music. I mean, it's, you know, just his ability for that is really amazing. You know, he can fit into a lot of different groups. You know. So I often have this thought that I'd love to, you know, do something. In fact, I think when I did that record for Jack, I think I was considering, when I did a trio record with DeJohnette, and I think I was thinking about getting Christian. Scheduling wasn't really working. I mean, I'm really lucky to have had Larry Grenadier, who's also a wonderful bass player, and I think it was just logistically seemed to all fall into that. So, I don't know. Maybe in the future there'll be something, you know, but yeah, we did do a number of trio things, which were really highlights, you know.
Based on things that you're saying, I kind of feel like I already know the answer to this, but how was he as a band leader in terms of like presenting music and having you guys learn the music, and because we've all worked with bands, but there's lots of different styles of how people run bands. So I'm just curious as to how his approach was to you learning the music.
I think it was really sort of, I would say, medium in the sense Well, he had a bunch of music. I mean, he had a very clear agenda. I mean, it wasn't just show up and play tunes. Like, he knew what he wanted to do, but he wasn't a control freak. I mean, some band leaders are they're so specific that you can feel stifled. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just they try to control every element of it, and there's a certain point, in my humble opinion. What I always like to say is, like, it's just my opinion based on 30 years of experience. I always say that to my students, and by now they just roll their eyes. But in my experience, I feel like there is a threshold where if you're going to control the situation that much, it almost ceases to be jazz. You know, if you are if you need to have every last detail controlled, at this point, you can actually make MIDI music, or you can write everything out, you know, and you could find people that want to rehearse 8 times a week, you know, and that's one approach. You know, I don't like that approach. I mean, and the older I get, the less I want to do things like that, because, and some people are just at the threshold, you know what I mean? But they're pushing it. You know what I mean? And I kind of wish I could tell them, you know, you don't have to be this controlling. Like, the music's going to be cool anyway. It's like I sort of liken it to, say, if I called, you know, DeJohnette, which I did, and I said, hey, Jack, I wrote out all your drum parts, like, gave him like 30-page charts, you know, of like, do-do-ga, do-do-ga, digga-digga-digga. And if he didn't play it exactly right, I'd be like, no, Jack, it's supposed to go digga-digga-digga-digga-digga, you know. And then have a 6-hour rehearsal on that, you know. Yeah. That would be stupid. That would be wouldn't make sense. So, just trying to stay with. So anyway, my point about Christian, he had a lot of respect. He has a lot of respect for that idea, even when he has music that is very, that's written, or it has things that you got to hit. But other than that, it's like he kind of lets you do what you do, and certainly, you know, he respected Billy, and I think he respected me enough to just, you know, he wanted. That's the thing, because he remembers, and he has a sense of what musicians sound like and what they do and what they're strong, where their strengths are. So I mean, this would be the same thing with Billy. Like, if he was really specific with Billy, you don't call Billy Hart to do something that you could get any drummer to do. You call Billy to do Billy Hart. So. I think he had a good sense of that without being too laissez-faire. Like, he wasn't just like, oh, let's just play open, or, you know, like some leaders are like, they're barely band leaders. You know what I mean? That can be cool too. I mean, the more I do this, the more I realize that it isn't a cop out. It isn't that you're trying to make it so easy that you don't have to practice, or that you don't have to put out any energy. But I think that there's it's that threshold where, you know, like some musicians, they just make it too hard for themselves, and it doesn't end up making the music better. It doesn't end up making it better for the audience. And it usually just makes the experience less fun, you know.
I think for maybe some of the people that watch these things are musicians, and some of them are students, and some of them are not. They just enjoy the show and watching it for whatever. But I think, more to your point, a lot of those, for each one of those circumstances, whether the music is completely through composed, or maybe not so much, or maybe not at all, a lot of what makes or breaks those things are the musicians involved playing in those situations too. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I was explaining this to somebody. I was like, you look at some of the great records in jazz and how minimal they are. I mean, what's the most listened to jazz record is Kind of Blue. I mean, it's all sketches. It's a blowing date. It's essentially a blowing date. It's like, here's the melodies. We're gonna have a bunch of solos. So oftentimes, you know, sometimes you hear musicians say, oh, I don't want to have stuff that's, you know, just like head solos head. I want to have something that feels more substantial. I get that. I totally get that. However, again, look at Bitches Brew, Kind of Blue, all the relaxing, steaming, all those things. Most of the records that we love are head solos head. But that's the thing, is like describing it in that way is like, oh, New York is just a city. You know what I mean? It's like you can't sum it, you can't reduce it to that. That's like saying, oh man, I love Supreme. All they do is play the head and take solos. I mean, are you kidding me? You know what I mean? So that's the thing, is like you want to give, that's the whole point of that kind of artistic freedom, is you want to give people that freedom so that they can create something rather than you tell them what to do. I mean, you can give little things here and there, and I mean, some people say that Miles didn't really say a whole lot, and I think, maybe some of the outtakes say otherwise. I think he kind of had ideas here and there. But I do believe that his ethos was to hire people that he liked what they brought to the situation, not like, I have an agenda and I need to have people who will fulfill that agenda. It's not to say that that isn't one way to do it. It's like some people are so, like maybe Prince would be somebody that is like this. I think that Prince, and he played all the instruments, so he could have just recorded everything himself. But I think he was more looking for people to fulfill his vision, not necessarily like, oh, I like what you do, I want you to come in and, I never worked with him and I never met him. But that's my impression from people I know who were around him, that he was very just, he wanted, it was about making his vision happen. And in pop music, that's a little bit different, but in jazz, I think I like the flexibility, and I certainly, again, I think that you can get so much more with so much less. You know what I mean? You'd be surprised. Like, not everybody wants to play free music, but to me, the more, or the more restrictive, I don't want to say it incorrectly because I don't want people to get the wrong idea. Because I write music and I want the music to be played. I mean, I don't, like if somebody's like, oh, I didn't check out your music because I know how loose you want it to be. That's not necessarily my vibe. But, it's sort of like there are certain criteria, and then you can veer from that. And like once it's your solo, you should be able to do what you want. And that's where the interaction comes in. You know what I mean? So does that make sense?
Makes total sense. Yeah, as cliche as it sounds, everyone says, jazz is a language, or music in general is a language, but more so even jazz, because there's that sense of every musician that's participating is a sum total of everything that they've listened to, everything that they've practiced, and everything that they've internalized. And if you give them a piece of music that's kind of locking them into doing something, you're not really giving them the opportunity to express themselves. I mean, I guess you kind of can within the parameters of the arrangement, but the less of an arrangement there is, the more they have the opportunity to convey how they might want to comp, or how they hear the melody being, addressed or not addressed, or what have you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just, again, it's like there's all kinds of analogies. It's like, I was just saying this to somebody. It's like if you got to judge things sometimes for what they are rather than what they aren't. And, great jazz musicians, they bring something that you want to make part of your music, not necessarily impose your vision on them. I mean, again, if you want your things to be through composed and very arranged, and you want people to play the parts, it's a different thing. It's just, I was thinking, if you had Mike Tyson when he was really happening, be like, oh man, Mike Tyson is one of the great boxers ever, but he probably couldn't run a marathon. Well, that's not why you're interested in Mike Tyson. So, you know what I mean? It's like you if you want him to box, he'll box, but don't try to get him to do pole vaulting. I mean, it's just not what he does, you know. So that, but a lot of, as obvious as that is, a lot of musicians miss that because they get this idea that, well, this is my vision. And it's like a control thing. And some elements should be controlled, but some of it, if you don't control it, then you're opening it up for more possibilities.
Do you feel that attitude amongst musicians, or maybe even listeners, in 2021 is different based on what we're seeing with maybe opinions that are taught in schools and magazines and online forums versus something in the 1950s? I know people complained about critics and their opinions then. Like, for example, when Coltrane first came out, everyone's like, oh, this is different, I don't like this. And then now it's become generally accepted that he was a genius.
Well, you just opened up 2 big cans of worms. How many people are watching? Education. How much time do we have? I mean, well, there's different levels of music education. There's sort of like primary, secondary. There's this sort of like school band, private lessons as a kid. There's the whole European classical tradition. There's obviously a lot of now there's all these online resources, what have you. I mean, there's all different ways of looking at music education, but I think that to me, jazz and creative music is, I think there are a surprising amount of educators that, and it's not necessarily their fault, but they just don't get it. And it's so ingrained that I think even if I went to them and say, hey, I have experience doing this for 30 years, and and I'm an educator too. I did music ed. My degree is in classical trumpet and music education from Peabody Conservatory.
Well, it's also a little different. If you were to approach someone with that, you could say, I've done this for 30 years, and there might be someone else that's done it for 30 years and never played with anyone, but you've played with all these great musical minds. The level of experience to those 30 years is a bit different.
Well, I don't want to be a jerk about it, but because some people they have egos. I mean, myself included. So I don't want to burst anybody's bubble, but I mean, I would think that if there's something that you like, the point of education is to help students. You know what I mean? And to disseminate information. So, for example, if I had a student, and I have some students who bring classical stuff, and so I think I can help them to a point. But there may be a point where I may have to refer them to somebody else, and that shouldn't be an issue. I know my threshold for that. You know what I mean? I have dabbled in classical piano. My degree was in classical trumpet, but I'm definitely a late starter with piano. So I think in terms of really knowing the repertoire, I mean, I can look at a score and say, well, fundamental principles of technique and music. But at a certain point, I may not know enough about it to, if somebody's really like, I want a career as a classical pianist, and that's all I'm going to bring for the next 3 weeks, I'd be like, you know what, you may want to go with so-and-so. I have a student now who is finishing their degree. They're going to do 1 term with me, and this person is a really, really talented singer-songwriter, and I think they're just starting to realize that. So I listened to one of their live streams the other day, and this person sort of left PSU and came back, and I listened to their stuff. I'm like, man, this stuff sounds great to me. It's like there's just all this talent there and all this ability, and I'm like sort of asking other people to step in. Like, I might just pay them out of my pocket and just say, look, can you, because he's paying through the school, I might just say, look, can you come to this lesson or listen to this person's stuff and tell me what you think, and help guide them. Because with music in general, but I think with singer-songwriters, and especially this dude, like, he already does have a little bit of a sense of the business too. And I just think he needs to gain confidence. I can tell him some things about the music, and I actually did a singer-songwriter record. It's not very good, but I did it. But so, and I've been around singer-songwriters, and so I just want to make sure he's in the right direction. It isn't about my ego. It's about him. I want him to see success. So I think eventually I would say, hey, you need to maybe, if you want to take lessons, or maybe you can just go out on your own and figure it out for yourself, like that's where the truth lies for me. But so a lot of, I think, music educators are very insecure. And so for them to actually say, hey, I don't know enough about jazz, I need help, is a lot for them. And some of that has to do with attitudes about the music. I mean, what's really sad is this is America's classical music. This is the, and I really believe that. I think this is such an important contribution to the world culture. And yet it is so misunderstood, and especially in this country. This is where the music comes from, and the vast majority of our Americans either know nothing about it or think they know something about it. And it's really mind-boggling. You know what I mean? Most of the tours I've done over the years have been in Europe and Japan. So there are a lot of places in this country I've never been and probably will never go because there just isn't the interest. And that's just weird. You'd think that, I mean, don't even get me on the political thing, but it's like, it's just weird. It's really weird. And so you take somebody that's respected as a music educator, and then you try to talk about jazz with them. I mean, and then you get people who consider themselves to be like knowledgeable about jazz, and it's like it's a whole different world. So, and I'm not saying I know everything, but it's just something that I've been noticing. And really what I want to do is just help. I want high schoolers to sort of be pointed in the right direction. You know what I mean? But oftentimes the band directors, I mean, now there are some hip high school band programs. Like I know there's a few in Seattle, Roosevelt and Garfield and some of those places,
Mount Si, Edmonds, there are several. Yeah.
Yeah, so those I believe are the exception. I know as somebody that did music ed that normally jazz pedagogy is not a requirement. It might be an elective. Somebody might be teaching it. But there are so many music educators that don't take it. They aren't jazz players. They don't listen to jazz. They never took jazz pedagogy. So they get into a school, and then it's like, oh, we have jazz band too. And they're like, well, what do I do? Well,
I think the other issue too is that's even worse. I mean, you might have someone in that situation, but they might know musicians and ways to direct the students to get that information. But I think what's even worse is when they get in that situation and they have no clue where to even begin to tell their students to go, except maybe watch the Ken Burns jazz documentary. No offense to anyone that loves that documentary.
I use that documentary in my class just because it's convenient, but I supplement it with things. Yeah, exactly. But that's what's sort of weird to begin with, is that something that is so much a part of America is yet a mystery to many, many, many Americans, and so underappreciated.
I think part of that, and I might be completely wrong about this, but I think part of this is if you look at cultures from Africa, from India, from the Middle East, from Asia, from Europe, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of years of history and appreciation of history. And I'm not saying that America doesn't have appreciation for history. What I am saying is in relation to the age of countries, it's a very, very young country by comparison. And so therefore, perhaps, for example, there's a friend of mine that I remember she was telling a story about her mother in the United States owns an antique store, and she had gone to India and was visiting and visited an antique store in India, and they were talking about their two stores, and the woman that was from India thought that it was kind of funny because in India, in order for something to be considered an antique, it had to be 500 years old. So just by comparison, I'm not talking trash about America at all. I'm just saying by comparison, it's a much younger country, and maybe that works or plays into the apathy towards arts in general, or art appreciation, or appreciation for jazz?
It may, and yeah, I guess I don't want to get into an America bashing thing, because that's a very easy road to go down these days. But but still, I think it needs to be addressed. And so the thing that I really would love to be able to do, at least in this region, is be a resource. You know what I mean? And but again, I think it's like some people just don't want to ask for help, or they just and look, I get it. Band directors, almost every band director I ever talked to, just seems exhausted. Well, it's a hard job.
At every turn, I mean, how many times do you know that the football team is getting funding, the music program is getting cut? I think a lot of them are just trying to hang on for dear life and have their job be relevant.
Absolutely. And but regardless, I think that oftentimes a big bands, or jazz band, whatever you call it, stage band, they used to call it, they're kind of run like wind ensembles, except with a little bit more syncopation. Like it's very easy for, you can order charts, you can just get pass out charts, and then people play the charts. But there's so much more to jazz that's on the page, and so that's where it kind of breaks down. And so you got to be able to tell the rhythm section what to do. You can't just say play the chart, because oftentimes that just doesn't tell them anything. And I would say that generally, or let's say 80 to 90% of the bands that I hear, the horns play their parts very, very well, and they've been rehearsed very, very well. But the soloists don't have a lot of vocabulary, and they sort of don't know where to begin. Sometimes they play written solos really well, but I've seen so many bands where the rhythm sections, it's like they're just kind of on their own, and I end up saying the same things over and over. And I kind of just wish, like, one thing I've really wanted to do, and I'm sure that it's out there, but I mean, have some kind of a pedagogical book that I would just give away for free. I'd say, like, but it's tricky, it's touchy, because the mentality is so different. It's like the competitions, you know what I mean? They want to go to these competitions, and they rehearse the same music over and over and over. They rehearse 4 tunes for a whole semester. Then they go to Reno, and they play those tunes, and they get accolades. But that's not it. That's really not it. So I think I was just lucky for myself, because I had music teachers that, were open-minded enough to kind of point me, like, they knew that they were not experts, but they knew enough to point me in the direction for various things. Like, one of the things is listening. Like I often say, the problem with jazz is that you actually have to listen to it to understand it. You can't read about jazz and understand it. You can't. I worked with a band director who said, he said, man, I don't know about Ornette Coleman. He just plays so out all the time. And even then, I was like, I don't think that makes any sense. I think he read that somewhere. Yeah. I think he read the words free jazz, and just developed an opinion based on that. And he was a good educator, a great educator. But so there's a lot of misconceptions. But so I was pointed in the direction of, listening. I took a music appreciation class in a summer camp, and that just got me really into listening, And I listened to the same records over and over, because I had to go to the library to get the records. We may have talked about this before.
This was uphill both ways in the snow without
exactly.
shoes,
right? Right. So there's the listening, and then there was also the Aebersalds that I played along with, and so. But you know what? I was really the only person in my high school to even try to improvise. So then it was really sort of that, when you're a big fish in a small pond, like people are like, oh, he's the jazz guy. But it was really only because I wasn't afraid to try. Everyone else was like, oh, I could never do that. You know what I mean? So I don't know. And the fact that, 40 years later, or 35 years, whatever it is, that we still have these issues is strange to me. And it kind of makes it harder, because when I get the students coming to Portland State, many of them who have this idea that they're going to have a life in jazz, or at least that's the implication of a degree, is that that's what you're going to go do for your life, or maybe something related to it. It sort of runs the gamut from people who have a little bit of experience, or some are really good. Some have the right, their band directors maybe did point them in the right direction, or they took some other, like in Portland, for example, we've had some programs outside of high schools that are a little bit hipper. And then you have Alan Jones, the A-Jam thing, which has been great for some of the students, But then you have people who come in and they just don't even know where to begin. And they don't even really find out whether they like jazz or not, because they don't even know enough to know whether they really like it. They just had fun playing in their jazz band in high school. So, and some of them find out, and then they really get into it. And some people are like, oh, I didn't know this was, you know what I mean? Like, I had a class once, I said, well, how many people here have heard Kind of Blue? None of them. So I'm like, well, what do you want to do this for your life? You haven't heard this is the most listened to jazz record in history. And so you know what I mean? It's like, and that's the thing. It may take by year 4 for them to kind of decide, because they just don't have enough experience with it. So I wish there was a way to change that, because that's better for the students.
Yeah, I ask a similar question to a lot of my high school students is, how many of you have heard Louis Armstrong? Maybe a couple. How many of you, Miles Davis? Same thing. And the one that killed me, this was a couple years ago, I asked how many of you know who James Brown was. No one knew who James Brown was. I was like, how? We're failing our children.
Well, that's the thing. It's not the students' fault, and it's not even really the band director's fault, because like I said, it is this culture. And honestly, I think that, it's just the status quo. And the places where the status quo that people have made an effort to change it. I mean, like even Peabody, for example. When I was at Peabody, there was no jazz program at all. And a bunch of us went to the dean and tried to get it happening. And then finally, this was after I left, Gary Thomas took it over, and he ran it for 20 years. Now Sean Jones is there. But that was really, you had to push against, Peabody is that's a real conservative conservatory. Like even Debussy is considered like, ooh, modern. That's some modern, when you do modern stuff like Debussy. You know what I mean? So now they have a hip-hop program, apparently, so that's really interesting. So I don't know. I'd love to figure out a way to change the paradigm, but I'm just one person, so I don't know if it's possible. But generally, teachers teach what they know. But I think that we also have to have an ear to the ground and say, well, what's the future? The future may not be, we have to try. I can't even say that I'll be successful, because I'm kind of behind the times too. You know what I mean? I've been teaching full-time for, 10 years at least, 12 years, about 12 years. And so there's a lot of stuff that I don't have awareness of, and that maybe because I'm older, I may be like, that's not really my thing. But the students, they might be like, oh man, just because I don't love Snarky Puppy, I don't sit around listening to Snarky Puppy, doesn't mean that my students shouldn't. If they like it and they want to do that, that may be the gateway into some other things that I'm more into. You know what I mean? And if other people are playing that type of music, then they should have some awareness of that. Like if I'm like, nah, man, you got to check out Hank Mobley or whatever, it's like they can do both. And I really think that today's musician has to be into kind of everything. you know?
I think that's an interesting point, and some of the other guests that we've had on here, I was surprised to learn that, for example, there's a great bassist up here by the name of Chuck Deerdorf. I'm sure you probably worked with Chuck. But I was interviewing him, and he was saying that some of the bassists that got him started into music led him, they were more like folks from the 70s or 80s, you know, versus further back. But after getting into jazz, then he went both forwards and backwards in terms of musical taste and appreciation. And I think a lot of take someone like Roy Hargrove, for example. Here's a person who could play anything that he wanted, going all the way back and all the way forward. And because of that, and a very beloved musician by so many different generations, where a lot of people know Roy Hargrove, but they might not know who Clark Terry was, or they might not know Wynton Marsalis, or so I think there's something to be said for a musician that can play all of these different styles within the gamut of jazz at a very high level.
Yeah, I mean, and I think Roy was somebody that was curious about everything. I think he was very curious, you know. And, you know, I think that most hip jazz musicians are a lot more open-minded than you may realize. I mean, I remember Don Byron was telling us, well, I did a master class with him in Worcester a number of years ago, and he was talking about how he was like in the dressing room. It was like Kenny Barron, Ray Drummond, maybe Ben Riley or something, and he said they were all talking about Pink Floyd, and it was something that just really boggled his mind, because he figured they would just be dyed-in-the-wool jazz people. You know what I mean? Like that sort of idea of like the jazz snobbery. But you know, you really kind of push people, you find out like that they were into, I mean, the legend is, because I got this from a drummer who lives in Paris now. He knew Wynton before Wynton Marsalis was Wynton Marsalis in New Orleans. He said all Wynton talked about was Earth, Wind and Fire and Parliament. That was his vibe. And then he became this kind of figure of like preserving the tradition, you know what I mean? So I mean, there's all kinds of people who were into different stuff. I mean, you know, I was super into Rush, you know. I was into some rap before it was called hip hop, you know what I mean? I had taped some Grandmaster Flash off the radio, and I listened to it over and over. That and Rush, and you know, I was into this album by Yes, Going for the One, and I was into 80s pop. Me and my sister used to sit around listening to American Top 40 with Case and Kasem, you know, and not that I ever wanted to play that music necessarily, but that was just what was happening, you know what I mean? And you can, regardless of what your chosen path is, because I think ultimately it can be a good thing to specialize, sort of like, this is my voice, this is my music, you know, but it can be informed by everything, you know. I mean, I was into Fats Waller. Nobody would necessarily listen to any of my records and be like, oh, I can tell he checked out Fats Waller. I don't think that's the case, but I loved Fats Waller, you know. So, and, you know, I listen to a lot of classical music, you know. There's so much music out there. And now everything is on Spotify. So that can be a really good thing. So I think people have to open their minds. And that's the thing. Like, you don't really know. Like, if you're too narrow right off the bat, you might sort of close yourself off from an opportunity that may lead you to something amazing. You know what I mean? So, you know, and people should feel free to do what they like. You know what I mean? Like, even if your teacher is like, this is the music, like, you can say, you know, you could say, well, this is something my teacher told me to study, but I'm also into this. There's no reason you have to pick necessarily.
And I think that's actually a very good point, because going back to the education thing, I think many teachers I've seen in my experience have been like, well, it has to be this, and unless it's this, it's no good. And then the student gets that misconception, and that can handicap them in many ways for many, many years, and hopefully they eventually figure it out. You know?
I mean, everybody is entitled to their opinion, but your opinion may change. Definitely may change. I mean, I'm trying to think of somebody who maybe I didn't quite get. I mean, in some ways, I'm a little bit weird because I always kind of liked like certain straight ahead things, whereas my classmates didn't really get jazz until later. Like I had a very good friend who was into, you know, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and, you know, I remember telling him that I played with these Aebersold records, and he was like, oh, it just sounds like background music. Like he just didn't get it. And I forget what it was. I think it was maybe Oscar Peterson Trio that, like he was very much, you know, into this other stuff, like into some folk things, like the Roaches, stuff like that. And, but at a certain point, he just switched the other way. He became a jazz snob. He said, yeah, I remember because I took all my Beatles and Rolling Stones and I just brought them to the consignment store in a box. He said, I just went and I was like, I'm done with these. I'm into jazz now, you know. And I don't think you have to do that either, but, you know. But I think just in terms of getting students who think they want to be jazz musicians, I want to make sure that they really understand what that entails. You know, I don't want them to sort of go through 4 years like, you know, with some kind of wishy-washy, watered down approach to it, and then they get out and they're like, how come I'm not getting any gigs, or how come I don't have a career? You know what I mean? So I want them to get sort of the the reality of it, you know.
Well, we're getting close to that time here. Do we have any questions from any of the audience? No questions yet. Comment. Okay.
Comment.
Yeah. What's the comment?
How hard it is to find a piano instructor who actually understands and knows jazz.
The comment is it's difficult to find a piano instructor that knows and understands jazz. I think maybe part of that could be the location that people live in, I suppose. I'm guessing here. If you're in a larger city, like a place like Portland, there's George, or in Seattle. I guess it depends on the city. I will say, though, yes, that is true. A solution now in 2021 is a lot of these great instructors are open to taking students and teaching online. And I am keenly aware that it's not the same as being there in the room with someone, but you can still get a lot of good information from studying with some of these masters online. Do you care to address that, George?
I'm available for you know, I don't know if I told you this. You know who Ari Honig is? Yeah, so Ari Honig is one of the great young, I mean, he's basically my age, but that's still young.
He has a pulse. He has a pulse.
Yeah, right. He's still alive. But he's been studying piano with me. He lives in New York. I live in Portland. And, you know, we just deal with the time difference. And he's a great student, you know. So that's been really one of the silver linings of the pandemic. I mean, thankfully, because the gigs have, as everybody knows, there's been few and far between in the past year. But, you know, I've been sort of able to make it work by having even just a handful, but it's still more than I've ever had outside of an institution, more private students, and it's all Zoom. Yeah. So that's been kind of cool, you know.
Well, I would say for people that also are not aware, you've started a YouTube channel, finally. We've talked about this the last couple of years, but you've got that going on, and lots of wonderful insights and your own opinions about things, and showing information and play-alongs. And
Thank you. Yeah, actually, just a word about the play-alongs. So there's a saxophonist named Bob Mover who he played with Chet Baker and Lee Konitz. He's a great musician. He just kind of sounded me out of the blue. He said, I'm starting a school, Bob Mover Academy, and, you know, it's mostly New York-based people, but I guess he saw one of my backing tracks that I did the piano, bass, and drums, and he had this idea that I would do backing tracks for him. And I said, okay, cool. Now then when he told me how many he wanted, it was like, okay, remember, I'm just one person, okay, you know. So I've made a whole bunch for him, and some people really like them. So I'm trying to figure out a way to kind of use that to maybe, I don't even know if I can, you know, charge for them, you know. I certainly would like to use it in some way to outreach, you know, or just give them to my friends, whatever. But, They're supposed to be sort of the official backing tracks of the school. And it's been kind of an education to do that, The thing is, I tried to make them sort of feel like a band, you know what I mean? This is my issue with the iReel. I mean, I think there are merits to the iReel because it is
for people that don't know what you're talking about iReel Pro, which is the play along app that
iReel,
many people have on their phones.
Yeah. So that's the thing now, is that people, they use this iReel Pro, and I think that it has its merits, but I think that it sounds like a computer, and no disrespect for the people who made that app, because I think it can serve a purpose. That being said, I'm starting to notice that when students, like we've had a lot of our juries where we can't have a band, so they do their jury along with iReel Pro, and I'm just like, I don't think this is helping people develop a feel for swing. Swing is such a delicate, subtle, rhythmic feel that if you have a computer doing it, it's sort of right off the bat not really right.
And quantized.
Because that's the thing. I think that there is an organic quality to jazz playing that if you don't have that, and so some of these people they're getting this iReel thing more in their ear than, Art Blakey or Tony Williams, or you know what I mean? They're not hearing that real swing. They're not hearing how musicians really interact, as much as they are the iReel thing. And so they develop this false sense of what jazz is supposed to sound like. Now, I mean, I was fortunate that I played with the Aversols are much better but they're limited because that's a recording. Yeah. And you can't manipulate it the way you can the iReel Pro. So anyway, that was one of my thoughts about this. It can be alleviated by just ending the pandemic. And people getting together, and that's what's best, I think, So, but that being said, as long as people know the difference, you gotta. That's why you gotta listen to records and hear. You gotta get that feeling in your ear,
Any questions before we? No questions. All right. Well, thank you so much to our viewers for watching. We hope you find some value in what we're doing here. Thank you so much to George.
Thank you, Kareem.
Yeah, and we've got a bunch of brand new music that George has written for today. We're going to be playing in a couple hours here. We're going to start the live broadcast at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So we're looking forward to doing that. And I've got some compositions as well we're going to be playing. If you found or find value in these programs that we're putting up online, again, they're 100% free. You don't have to sign up and give us your email address. You just tune in and watch them. But if you enjoy it and find value in it, please consider making a donation. You can either do that online via Venmo or PayPal, or by mailing an old-fashioned check, but all of those things are helpful and we'd appreciate it. And so thank you for joining us, and hope to see you back here soon in a couple hours. See you later.